So let's look at presenting and collecting data. Well, the first thing I suppose is we'll talk a bit about data and the types of data. And just to say that, I suppose we collect data. How do we do that? Well, we do that using surveys, okay? And surveys contain, basically, we use maybe questionnaires, a set of questions, and we use that to collect the data, which we then compile. And we compile our data once we've asked the questions and we have the answers using tally charts or frequency tables, where these are our tallies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So we can see here that this might be an example here of a typical tally chart or frequency table, where we have the category here, which in this case is the method that students use in getting or going to school. They either walk, take a bus, or cycle. 9 students were asked how did they get to school. 6 said they walked, 2 came by bus, and 1 came by bike. And these tallies are otherwise known as frequencies, so with the numerical value, I suppose, is 6, 2, and 1. And then sometimes we're asked from our frequency table what fraction of the students walked to school. Well, in this case, it's 6/9, or it's 2/3, or 2/9 took the bus to school, or the fraction that cycled to school was 1/9. In a moment, we'll see how we can also represent this data in other ways, either using a line plot or a bar chart, but we'll come to that in a while. So we'll just briefly talk about the data types. Okay, so there's, I suppose, 2 types of data initially. Primary data is that data that you collect yourself, or secondary data, data that's already been researched and compiled and collected, or whatever, collected and compiled and is held or stored somewhere, either on the internet or, for example, the birth records for a hospital might be stored within the hospital, and you might access that data and represent it on using charts or plots or whatever, and analyze the data and draw conclusions. But the fact that you've got the data from somewhere else means that it's secondary data. Now, when we look at data itself, then of course there's numerical data, and there's 2 types of numerical data. There's discrete, and that type of data is best described as the number of boys who, the number of chairs in a classroom, the number of this, the number of that. Discrete numerical data is something you can count, whereas the other type of numerical data is known as continuous. And continuous numerical data is data that can be measured on some scale, like temperature, weight, length, age. So it's on some comparative scale. And then finally, the other type of data we need to mention is categorical. So that's data that falls into groups or categories. So we might do a survey in a car park of the colours of cars. So the colours of cars, black, red, blue, silver, would represent a category. But there's other types of categorical data, and sometimes the categories can be divided into subgroups. Okay, so where that occurs, we call that ordinal data. So we might pose the question, how often did you go to the library last year? And the answers could be something in different categories. Subcategories could be very often, often, sometimes, not often, or not at all. Okay, and that's what's written here, but you can't actually see it. But basically, ordinal data is data that is kind of subdivided, is categorical data subdivided into further subgroups, where there's choices offered to the person answering the questionnaire or the survey. So let's look at 2 ways of presenting data. Well, the first way we met in the chapter was to do a line plot, where this is the said line, okay, and underneath the line we have the categories. Okay, in this case, from our tally table above, the methods that students used going to school, that fell into 3 categories: walk, bus, or cycle. Okay, and then for each student we looked at our frequency chart, our frequency here. So For walking to school, we place 6 dots to represent the frequency, and for the bus we have 2 dots in our line above our line plot, and for cycling 1 dot. Okay, so basically a line plot has the categories along the bottom, okay, the horizontal axis if you like, and vertically then we're looking at the frequency, how often it occurred, or that option was chosen. And moving on from the line plot, we also met with the bar chart, which later on we might get to call the histogram, but for now we'll call it a bar chart. And a bar chart again has the categories along the horizontal axis and the frequency along the vertical axis, how often something occurred. Notice how we label the axis. Notice how our bars are the same width, okay, for the data, and we have gaps between the bars, and they're the same width as each other and also the same width as the data bars. And you can also see that sometimes the data is represented like this, with the bars going vertically, and other times you might see bar charts the other way, the other orientation, where the frequency is represented along the horizontal. Either way is fine, but I expect this is the more common chart type that you'll meet with. And before we move on to the stem and leaf plots, the final part of the chapter, we'll just remind ourselves that when we're carrying out a survey and we're looking to generate some data, we must pose the question, collect the data, present the data, and then analyse or interpret the data. And we must also be mindful of the fact that the questions we ask should be clear, short, and easily understood. The surveys should generally start with easy questions, like a checkbox for male or female. We should avoid leading questions, so do you think politicians are overpaid? That's not a great question for a survey, because it's kind of putting the thought into the candidate's mind, and they might just agree with that. And apart from that, then the last rule we need to watch is that we avoid embarrassing questions. So we don't ask people their age, we ask them to tick within an age range, 15 to 20, 20 to 25, or 21 to 25, and so on. Okay. So let's take a quick look at stem and leaf plots. So, for example, below the number of points gained by soccer teams in a league. So we have 20 pieces of data here. That means we have 20 soccer teams, and these are the points that they accumulated in the league in a particular season. So one team got 38, another team got 62, and so on. To draw the stem and leaf plot of this data, we draw our stem, and we look through the data, and we look for, I suppose, for the highest and the lowest number. And the lowest number in the data is 24, and the highest is 80. So we know that our stem and leaf plot goes 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. Okay, and then we go through the data, and we look for any values that are in the 20 to 29 range, and we see there's 24, and we mark in all the values between the 30 to 39 range, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, 60 to 69, none in the 70 to 79 range, and there's one more piece of data in the 80 to 89 range. And don't forget to put your key, and this key tells us that when we see something like 62, that actually means 62. Okay, so this first run, if you like, we just throw the data down as we see it and as we meet it, going along the line, left to right and top to bottom. But then we move on to here, where we can see that we've put the data in correct numerical order. So we can see the first piece of data is 24, then it's 30, 33, 34, 38, 38 again, 39, 41, 45, and so on to 80. And then typically, once you've done the stem and leaf plot, you'll be asked some questions like how many teams got 60 points or more. So you have to go from here and count the number of teams: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams. The difference between the highest and the lowest, well, you'll take 24 from 80, and that would be the answer to that. And then the percentage of teams that score between 40 and 50 points. So you're looking at essentially the teams in this range, and you've 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams there, and you have a total of 20 teams, so your percentage there would be 25%.